Hey everyone, my name is Alex Kumar. I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. And I'll be presenting some work today led by Dave Theobald. He unfortunately wasn't able to make it to SRM this year, so I'll do my best to do his work justice. Um, so overall, I'm going to be talking about incorporating connectivity into the sagebrush conservation design. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the rest of our co-authors. Obviously, Dave Theobald led the analysis. He's the main author. And we also have myself, Kevin Doherty, Kathy Zeller, and Todd Cross. Okay, so stepping back, we saw a little bit of the slide from Kevin, but I really wanted to make the point that the sagebrush biome is the most intact area in the continental US. So this map shows human modification, and darker areas have less human modification. And the sagebrush biome is outlined in that lime green color. And you can really see it has markedly less human modification than the rest of the US. But that doesn't mean that this biome is without its threats. So we have two main threats here, conifer encroachment and invasive annual grass thread. And these two threats, combined with some other factors, have led to decreasing quality of the sagebrush biome over time. And they've also led to the development of the sagebrush conservation design. So this was an effort led by multi-agency scientists to come together and try to come up with a proactive plan to restore this biome. And the sagebrush conservation design was based off of 5 different ecosystem attributes. It considered the positive effects of sagebrush cover and perennial grass cover with the negative effects of annual grass cover, human modification, and conifer cover. And so that came together to produce the sagebrush conservation design. We've seen this map multiple times. Generally, the core areas are in dark blue, the growth opportunity areas are in light blue, and the other rangeland areas are in tan. But importantly, one thing that phase one, of the sagebrush conservation design that did not include was connectivity. And by connectivity, I simply mean how easy or hard it is for plants and animals to move throughout the landscape. And it turns out when you define connectivity, there's a couple different types of connectivity we could be examining. So we have structural connectivity, and this uses landscape and habitat features to approximate how species might be moving throughout the landscape. Alternatively, we can contrast that with functional connectivity. And functional connectivity explicitly incorporates species behavioral responses. So it uses things like movement data or genetic data to actually quantify how they're moving about throughout the landscape. And these two different approaches to connectivity have pros and cons. So structural connectivity approaches are typically best when we're considering large landscapes and many species simultaneously. On the other hand, functional connectivity is best when we have a more defined study area and we're really only interested in one or maybe a few key species. So because I mentioned we are interested in quantifying connectivity throughout the biome, we focused in on structural connectivity. And we also have the word dynamic in front of that. And that's just to recognize the fact that connectivity changes throughout time, right? And so we wanted to incorporate that dynamic temporal nature of connectivity as well. But you might be wondering, why are we so focused on connectivity? Why is it a good idea to include it in the sagebrush conservation design? And it turns out that areas that have high connectivity are able to retain high levels of ecological functioning, which ultimately can lead to higher levels of biodiversity. Higher levels of connectivity can also minimize the negative impacts of habitat fragmentation. And we also see higher levels of connectivity being able to facilitate adaptation to different stressors, especially now with climate change being a major stressor throughout the biome that Martin alluded to already. Higher levels of connectivity can help mitigate against those impacts. So with that background, our overall goal was to extend the sagebrush conservation design by explicitly incorporating connectivity. And we had 4 main objectives. First, we wanted to quantify connectivity across the biome. And then recognizing that dynamic nature of connectivity, we wanted to examine the interannual variations in connectivity. Third, we wanted to calculate the trends in connectivity over time. Perhaps connectivity stays relatively stable, or maybe there's an overall declining trend in connectivity, or perhaps maybe an overall increasing trend. And finally, we wanted to identify the best of the best core sagebrush areas that also have the highest amounts of connectivity. Okay, so one method slide. I apologize. There's a lot of words and even an equation, but we'll get through it quickly and get on to the fun results. So our connectivity model was based off of sagebrush ecological integrity, which was calculated in the sagebrush conservation design. And so briefly, SEI was calculated by combining the positive effects of sagebrush and perennial grass cover with the negative effects of annual grass cover, human modification, and tree cover. And so we took SEI and transformed it into what we call SEIC, or SEI connectivity, by applying a resistance kernel using the equation shown above. Basically, all you need to think about with that equation, Q5 represents sort of a patch scale SEI metric that ranges between 0 and 1. We set alpha to 2, and so if you plug in the numbers there, you end up with resistance values on the low end of 1 and on the high end of 4. And I just want to note here that we use resistance kernels, and they calculate the cost and distance to move throughout the landscape and are a good approximation for structural connectivity. Okay, on to results. So Dave made this really cool animation that shows SEIC over time. Areas in blue are high SEIC, areas in tan are lower. And we can see there's some dynamic nature to this connectivity values over time, but we also see that giant blue core in Wyoming that Martin showed earlier, and that stays pretty stable throughout time. So that was a map just of SEIC. What happens if we also incorporate stability into this metric? And so areas in red not only have high connectivity, they're also stable through time, which means they're consistently having high levels of connectivity. We can contrast that with areas in blue, which are lower in connectivity, and they're also more variable. So sometimes they might have really low levels of connectivity, and sometimes it might increase a little bit. But the main takeaway here is we're seeing higher amounts of these darker red areas in core sagebrush areas. See a little bit in growth opportunities, but they're virtually non-existent in other rangeland areas. And what happens if we look at trend in connectivity over time? So we have connectivity values on the y-axis, time on the x. Core sagebrush areas are in gray, growth opportunity areas are in blue, and other rangeland areas are in that kind of gold color. And so there's two main takeaways I hope folks get from this graph. First, if we look at the gray core sagebrush areas, we see much higher connectivity values. So that supports the previous maps we've shown that these core sagebrush areas have higher connectivity. And secondly, if we look at all three of these lines, they're showing negative trends in connectivity throughout time. And actually, if we look at core sagebrush areas, they actually have the steepest decline in connectivity through time. And we found that initially surprising, and upon thinking about it, we reflected that perhaps that's maybe partially due to the fact that core sagebrush areas already have such high SEI values to begin with, and they have a lot of room to go down. If we compare that with something like other rangeland areas, they're already at such a low level of connectivity, there's only so much further down they can go. And then lastly, we wanted to combine SEIC and aggregate it into larger patches to really identify the best of the best areas for connectivity. So these are the most connected areas on the biome, and the most connected areas are shown with the darker shades of green. And so that big chunk in Wyoming really pops. We also see some darker green in northeastern Montana, south central Oregon. And Dave made an animation to show how this varies through time. And so the color scheme's a little different. It's now in shades of blue instead of green. But we can project this out from 2000 to now and see how it's changed. And actually, following these projections, it's pretty dynamic through time, except that core in Wyoming. It really stays consistently core almost every time step. Okay, so wrapping up, what are some take-home points that we can all leave here with? Overall, we've shown that connectivity is declining across the biome, but we've identified ecosystem anchors where we can focus our conservation efforts on. These anchors have high connectivity, low interannual variability, meaning that they stay highly connected year after year after year, and also lower overall rates of decline. If you remember, we showed pretty steep rates of decline for core sagebrush areas. That's an average over all of them. If we look at these highly connected cores, they have much lower rates of decline than the overall average. Finally, we can see that anchors exist throughout the biome, They exist mostly in cores in states such as Wyoming, Oregon, and Montana. And I would just want to add a note here that this connectivity work provides complementary information that can be combined with other chapters in phase 2 of the sagebrush conservation design. So the climate projections that Martin showed, fire probabilities, where we should be targeting invasive annual grasses and conifers, they all provide complementary information that when used together can give a much better picture of what's going on by and why.